Good morning, everyone. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today. And there's many lands that we are occupying today, and that we respect or pay our respects to those elders that are present and those that are with us today. Welcome to the launch of Industry Super Australia's Road to Recovery campaign. I'm Bernie Dean, the Chief Executive of Industry Super Australia, and I'm delighted that so many people have been able to join us from across the network, and also extending beyond that. So we've got chairs and chief executives and other representatives of industry super funds. We've got representatives from the media that have joined us by invitation. We've got our panel members who we will meet in a moment, and we've got Jon Faine, and Jon's going to be facilitating today's session, and the question and answer and discussions to come later on. Jon will be familiar to all of you as the voice of Melbourne and a real icon of Australian journalism. His commitment to the informed public, or to having an informed public, and also to make sure that debates are open, transparent and fact-based is legendary, as is his commitment to being balanced in journalism. And so we're very happy to have Jon join us today and help us make us way through this really important set of issues that can affect individuals today and during their retirement. So without any further ado, I'll ask Jon to introduce the panel and get the show on the road. Thank you, Jon.
Thank you, Bernie, and I too would like to pay my respects to the First Nations people on whose land all of us, wherever we are meeting, and also personally to express my impatience for a treaty or treaties with the First Nations people of Australia in order to take one step towards doing right all the things that we have done wrong and our predecessors have done wrong over many, many years. It's a very simple engagement today. It's an opportunity to get beyond some of the basics and to speak to people who are going to be making decisions that are vital to the recovery. The prospect of building back better is literally in front of us. And the people you're going to have a chance to speak to and ask questions of today are some of the people who will be making those very decisions. And from an industry super perspective, it's a valuable opportunity to have the chance to talk to everybody. The procedures are pretty simple. There's a question and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you'll see that down the bottom there, ignore some of the other bits and pieces, and you're probably, most of you, familiar now with the procedures and the opportunities that present to you there. But the one that we want is not the chat line, but the Q&A button. And I'll take the questions by text, and I'll invite you at any stage to submit questions. It's best not to wait till the end, because then they'll all come in a flurry and I'll struggle to work out which ones should be directed to which people. So as you have an idea, as you have a question, don't be shy. Be quite prepared early on, even if necessary, to put a question in there. I'll read them out, and the only rule really is to ask your question of one person. Please try to avoid asking a question of the entire panel, because doing that's like asking half a dozen questions and we won't get through very many. We've removed the raise a hand facility, so questions should be submitted in writing. And you can use the chat line for general comments or feedback if you want to, or technical issues. We do have support staff on hand if you have any particular problems. The distinguished panellists really require little introduction. Greg Combet, who chairs Industry Super Australia and IFM, he's been involved in Industry Super for 30 years, previously a most successful politician and head of the ACTU. You've heard from Bernie Dean, who's been involved now in super for years and years and has been involved in the union movement and public sector work at a senior level throughout his working career. Denita Wawn, who's a CBUS trustee director and CEO of Master Builders Australia, the first female CEO in its 130-year history. Vicki Doyle, who's CEO of Rest Super, more than 17 years senior experience in superannuation, insurance, wealth management and banking. David Neal, who joins us recently from the Future Fund and now heads up IFM, and it'll be fascinating to hear his fresh eyes perspective on how things go. He was its inaugural Chief Investment Officer before he became Chief Executive Officer. So David, welcome in particular to your first ISA event. And Daryl Browning, who's got a lifelong career in property, in the property industry. He's an absolute legend and is now the CEO since April 2005 of ISPT. So those are our panelists. We'll start with an overview from Greg Combet in just a moment, but before we get there, this roundtable is also an opportunity to launch a new ad from Industry Super Australia from ISA, which is designed to try to reinforce the opportunities available in this particular environment, the post-pandemic environment that we're hopefully soon entering. Victoria aside, we do have our struggles. So let's have a look first though at the ad, and then we'll hear straight off the back of it from Greg Combet.
We're working on something bigger than we've ever done before. It's bigger than this, and this, and even this. We're creating over 200,000 jobs by investing in Australia. That'll help get our super and the economy growing again. And if you're with one of these, you're a big part of it.
So that's the ad, which will be today, which is launched today as of now. And that sets part of the scene. Greg Combet, for each of our guests, I'll start with you first. If you just want to use a few minutes of time to set the scene, and then I'll have some questions for you before we move on through from there. Greg, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, John, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for participating. Today, as John's outlined, and as you've seen, we're launching an industry super fund campaign demonstrating what we are doing to grow members' super accounts and to create jobs as part of the economic recovery from COVID-19. You all know Australia and the global economy are now in serious recession. Australian unemployment, I think, is probably in the region of 15% when you take into account those on JobSeeker and those on JobKeeper who likely have no hours of work. Monetary policy can't do much more to stimulate the economy, and the work's going to have to fall to fiscal policy. The government will need to transition from massive expenditure to support incomes to massive expenditure to stimulate jobs growth from both public and private sector investment. Excuse me. Our superannuation savings system obviously has a big role to play, and industry super funds are going to be a key part of that. We've been in dialogue with the federal government and some state governments to advocate a partnership approach to infrastructure investment, but obviously the industry funds, excuse me, continue to invest in many different markets, recapitalising listed companies, debt markets, investing in property and other unlisted assets in particular. Crucial to the industry fund's contribution to economic recovery will be policy stability. We've managed the first round of early access withdrawals from super and are entering into the second round from tomorrow of $10,000 withdrawals. We've prepared for this, but the capacity to invest for the long term will be seriously affected should there be further policy changes impacting liquidity requirements or contributions that come into the superannuation system. And we're also enduring, yet again, another round of attack on the already legislated superannuation guarantee rise due in July next year. Now, it's noteworthy and important to bear in mind that the super guarantee actually reached 9% way back in 2002, and it's only increased by 0.5% in 18 years. And if the advocates of freezing the super guarantee were to succeed, the impact on people's retirement savings would be significant, and it would be made much worse for those who may have withdrawn $20,000 under the early release arrangements. For example, for a 30-year-old male on average earnings, the impact of both measures would mean $180,000 less at the retirement age of 67, or alternatively, to make that money up, working for an extra 6.5 years to age 73 or 74. For a 30-year-old female on average earnings, it'd mean $150,000 less at retirement age, or alternatively an extra 8 years of work through to age 75. That's the significance of a freeze to the super guarantee rise, and in the circumstances where someone may have withdrawn $20,000 from their super. So there shouldn't be any further delays to the super guarantee rises. They've been delayed for years. They've been promised repeatedly. They've been legislated by the Parliament, and they are law. The next 0.5% increase is not due for another 12 months, and it's imperative that it goes ahead to benefit people's retirement savings. The argument that it will cost people a wage rise is a complete furphy. Freezing the super guarantee will only achieve costing people the super guarantee. No one will be gifted a wage increase in return. For someone on $50,000 a year, it's only an additional $5 a week in super contributions, and it is economically affordable. So as well as benefiting people's living standards in retirement, the super system is also critical to the economy and can make a very significant contribution to economic recovery from the pandemic. And so today, in launching the ISA campaign, we're showing that the industry super funds will be creating over 200,000 jobs over the next 3 years by investing in our own economy. We want industry super fund members to understand how their retirement savings are being invested, not only to boost their account balances, but also help get the economy growing again. Our upcoming Super in the Economy report will identify a $19.5 billion investment pipeline for new developments, capital upgrades, and productivity driving projects over the next 3 years. The 200,000 jobs figure is a conservative figure. It's focusing only on investments in infrastructure and property, measuring the benefits of capital expenditure in unlisted assets. And we believe that the overall number of our investments, the overall impact on jobs, will be more significant. I'd like to thank all of the funds and ISPT and IFM for their help in putting together the data for the report, and that has informed our new campaign, and thank them for all of their support to date. And I'll look forward to some questions. Thank you.
Greg, you're calling for policy stability, but at the same time, the Retirement Income Review is about to be released. It's somewhat unlikely that the government will commission a report, receive a report, and then say, but we're going to provide policy stability by ignoring it. So how are you going to deal with the fact that that is a reality? It is coming. You're going to have to deal with it.
Well, I guess we're sending a few signals about that, John, at the moment, and just trying to emphasise how important it is to have stable policy settings if our super system, which in scale is about 150% the size of annual GDP in Australia, if the system's going to be able to really make its best possible contribution to economic recovery. It's also worth bearing in mind that the Retirement Incomes Review is supposed to be, and we expect it to be, simply a statement of the facts about our retirement savings system and its various sources. So it's not expected to be positing policy changes, but of course, all of the different players in the system that will have an interest to push, no doubt will respond in different ways. But from industry super's point of view, it's really important the super guarantee go ahead.
The full impact of one round, and in the new financial year that kicks off later this week, we're going to see another round of presumably similar numbers of people wanting to take out $10,000, many of them young people, and we've seen what some of it gets spent on. Was it a mistake to have such a low threshold of evidence required, well actually no evidence required, of hardship before letting people take that money out?
I think the government and the ATO and the various agencies have realised that the criteria should have been developed and applied for the early access scheme. I don't want to be overly critical because at that point in time when this policy initiative was being developed, we didn't as a nation really know what we were facing and the full extent of the hardship that people would experience. But I think as we go forward now, it's really important that the ATO apply a set of criteria and that we monitor this much more carefully. There's about 500,000 people who've completely cleaned out their super accounts already, and for them to make that up in the years ahead before they retire, it's going to be very, very difficult, and it'll only push more people onto the age pension and a bigger burden on taxpayers in the future. So this policy measure needs to be pretty carefully monitored from here, John.
I'm sure there'll be questions for you. I've got a few questions already, and if you want to send questions in, you don't have to wait till the end because there'll be a mad rush. You can send them in as we go. Our next speaker is Denita Wawn from Master Builders, who is also a CBUS trustee. Thanks very much, Denita.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're very proud of the fact that construction was deemed an essential industry through the suppression phase that meant we could still employ 1.1 million people around the country. That has been essential from an economic activity point of view on saving jobs and also a focus on safety and well-being of our workers. Credit certainly the relationships that were forged around the CBUS board table in enabling that outcome to occur. Had it not been for the relationships that we have through an equal representation model and those discussions that we had in those crucial days with representatives from both the CFMEU and also the AWU, for us to collectively work together as one industry to ensure the viability of the industry that stayed open is a credit to some of the positives that come out of industry super funds. It enabled us to work collaboratively in lobbying governments to show that we could work together for the safety and well-being of our workers, but still enable one of the largest industries in the country to still work to have a positive impact in terms of economic recovery. So as we come out of suppression and we are looking now more to recovery, we know that the construction industry can play a huge role in rebuilding the country from an economic point of view, but also from a built environment perspective. As one of the industry with the highest multiplier in terms of economic activity, we're under a unique opportunity to not only create jobs in building and construction, but also significant jobs indirectly as well. For every $1 spent in the industry, $3 is created through economic activity, and at least another 3 jobs, indirect jobs as well, from one worker in building and construction. So we are focusing very heavily as an industry in terms of, as Greg indicated, a turn to fiscal policy to ensure that we've got stimulus to maximise that multiplier impact and to ensure we get as many people staying in jobs, but more importantly, create jobs as well. We know that this is not going to be simple. We've certainly seen some early indications from the home builder, but many state governments have also indicated stimulus through civil and commercial and social infrastructure. But equally, we know this should only be the start, that there is a lot more to do. And that's where we think that there is an opportunity for industry super funds and superannuation in generally to play its role and part of that road to recovery. And CBUS is certainly in a unique opportunity and position to maximise that role in rebuilding the country from an economic point of view. CBUS undertakes 3 key areas of investment into the industry and creation of jobs as a consequence. Firstly, from our fantastic CBUS property, a unique investment channel that we utilise and has had fantastic returns for the industry. CBUS property has recently announced a project in Puri Street in Adelaide that will create 2,000 jobs. We also have the opportunity through infrastructure, both direct and indirect as well. And finally, the increasing use of debt financing. And CBUS is very proud to ensure that we have been able to be involved in social infrastructure and social housing through NIFIC with only an announcement last week. And we're looking at further opportunities about how we can be more involved in social and affordable housing. Finally, I think it's really unique with industry super funds that you do have representatives from the industry sitting around the table. And CBUS can tap into that industry knowledge as we work towards the road to recovery in terms of increasing and protecting jobs in the sector, but equally playing a significant role in rebuilding the economy of the country, which, let's face it, is unfortunately going to be a 3 to 5 year task. So we all need to be in the long haul in terms of doing our bit to play a road to recovery. Thank you, John.
Denita, ironically, I have a tradie at our house as we speak who has lost his job on a big project and therefore is available to do a tiny little project at our place. What's quickest to get people back into work? Because big infrastructure projects take years to get off the ground. What's the quickest way of getting jobs going?
The quickest easy one is where you don't need planning, because we all know how a headache planning approvals are. So that's why maintenance projects is so important, doing fit outs of commercial properties and social infrastructure. Small jobs, renovation jobs, equally, you can not entail any property requirements as well. So the home builder is a good example where while building approvals is required, it's quick and easy and it employs a large number of people. But that's just an early shot in the arm to resolve some of those shortages that we were facing. That pipeline, that valley of death is the term that was being used. We now need to turn our minds to more medium and long-term infrastructure. But that's why we think commercial and social infrastructure is so incredibly important, because it employs a lot of people and the delays aren't as acute as large civil infrastructure projects are.
Seeing in forward market projections at Master Builders, are you already getting some information coming through?
Unfortunately, John, it's not been pretty. Master Builders forecasting and our survey work is showing a 40% decline in residential and commercial construction. Civil is not badly affected, about 10%. So the focus for all of us is making sure we can reduce that gap. As I said, home builder is a start. Many of the residential builders are telling them they're seeing a threefold increase since COVID started, since home builder was announced. But it's not going to fill that long-term void that we all need to collectively work together.
Oh, 40%, that's a huge figure. I'm sure there'll be questions about that. Don't wait till the end to send your questions in. Feel free to type them right now on the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and I'll moderate those as we go through. Thanks very much, Denita. Vicki Doyle is next, and thank you very much, Vicki.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Hopefully you can hear me well. Well, firstly, I think we have to acknowledge that these have been extraordinary times and they required extraordinary solutions, and early release of super was certainly one of those surprise extraordinary solutions. We had 4 weeks to get prepared for members to access their super, and in the case of REST, we typically have 100 applications per week, and 4 weeks later we had 65,000 in the first week of early release. So it's ever since then we've been answering thousands and thousands of calls, which is only 3 or 4 months, or it feels like 3 or 4 years, but 3 or 4 months ago we've been answering thousands of calls of Australians, REST representing 1.75 million Australians right across the nation, who've been worried about market returns. They've been worried about obviously accessing their superannuation quickly, and equally they've been worried about their insurance. However, it's really important to remember, and I know everybody knows this, but the purpose of superannuation is about long-term savings and retirement income. And for many working Australians, hard-working Australians, they need this income. And in some short times, it's actually they can't work any further. And I saw some interesting research yesterday from ASFA. And since 1988, or sort of 30 years ago when SG was mandated, Australian households now have over 500 billion in savings that they would not have otherwise. And 35 billion of that additional savings is for workers in the bottom 20% by lower income. And typically those families and households didn't have any assets or savings, including superannuation. So even if those amounts are smaller in nature, they are fundamental to helping all Australians participate. And in the case of those savings had been with REST and other industry funds, I'm sure, since 1988, those members would have received 8.21% average annualized return every year. And that includes a GFC. It includes coronavirus up until 30 April. So we have weathered those storms, and Australians can benefit from that in a way that they would never be able to access the markets. And obviously, in addition to that, to Greg's point earlier, billions of dollars then gets invested back in Australian infrastructure and businesses. At Rest, we've got $8 billion that is in the domestic market in Australia. And it provides key services. So in Rest's case, we invest in property, particularly through shopping centres, and those shopping centres are often in regional communities. So they are a hub and a community centre for regional members. We invest in agriculture. We've got 350 million, and we're about to increase that another $500 million that we've committed, again, right across Australia, rather than just being in urban areas. There's social infrastructure that we invest in, like schools and hospitals, energy generation and distribution, airports and toll roads and the like. So it really is important that we have policy stability and we consider the benefits of superannuation as a long-term investment. I mean, I look from the outward in, and if I was in any other country, the fact that we have this amazing virtuous system or a self-sufficient system is just amazing. And I think it's one of the strengths of Australia. And I just, before I finish, want to just touch on the 12% piece that Greg touched on. The reason that SG increase is so important is that so many more members now, and Australians, have drawn their balances down to lower balances. We're facing into perhaps several years of lower returns. People could have continued broken working patterns, multiple jobs. They may be hit by the 450 threshold and get zero superannuation at various times in their working career. And mostly women have drawn down on their superannuation, more so in terms of their actual balance. They've drawn those to a lower amount than men. So in order for them to recoup and try and get back to where they were, they're facing quite an uphill battle. And without that increase in SG, I can see that that's going to be very challenged. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Vicki. There's a criticism that's been aired quite widely that sector-specific super funds like yours are not showing enough diversity and therefore are vulnerable. What's your response to those critiques? Yes,
well, I think the fact that 14% of Rest members have accessed super, but what we don't focus on is 85% have not. So 85% of Rest members have not drawn down on early release, and that goes to the diversity that's in Rest. Rest is one of those historic funds that is often people's first fund as they come into part-time jobs, but they stay with us as they move through their careers. So only 60% of Rest members are associated with retail or in retail, and the other 40% have transitioned. So I think, John, my view is that argument around concentration risk was something that might have been more prevalent in the past, but certainly for the big funds is not of any significance now. I mean, we've paid out nearly 1.77 billion, but remembering we have over 54 billion in funds under management. So it's a very manageable proportion. However, we want to make sure that we continue to be able to invest in Australia. So we want to make sure that there are no further changes to superannuation that are not positive.
You mentioned agribusiness, which is something that your fund is notoriously well recognised for and famous for. Can you give us a bit more detail and put some flesh on those bones? What sorts of things? Are there any examples you can offer to us?
Well, we invest with an organisation, co-partner, if you like, with a group called Warrakiri, and they have rain-fed crops in Queensland, Victoria, New South Wales, and around Australia. And that is a very professionally run. We've been in that investment for many years, and they have done an excellent job of really investing in agriculture and taking it to the forefront. What agriculture really needed was corporate investors or investors who could be there for the long term, and in agriculture that can be decades, to help farmers and communities invest in technology. Agriculture is one of Australia's comparative advantages. It's something that we have a long history in, but often farming communities and farmers don't necessarily have the capital or the wherewithal to put in the technology and the management structure. So we've worked as an active investor in agriculture and work closely with groups like Warrakiri to expand and invest in these farms, who then generate great long-term returns that counter and diversify to equities and the like, so that we make sure we've got a really good, broad, diversified portfolio.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's fascinating. I could learn more about it for hours. I'm sure there's an opportunity for people to ask questions about that and other things. Just use the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. I've got a couple of questions, and we'll get to questions after we hear from Dave and from Daryl. So David Neal, who is new to Industry Super, coming from the Future Fund. Let's hear from you next.
Thanks, John. You know, as you know, IFM manages over 150 billion on behalf of industry superannuation funds and other like-minded funds from around the world. We manage those assets across equities, private equity, credit, and infrastructure. And there are opportunities across all those asset classes, we think, to contribute to the economic recovery. We've been pretty active working on trying to find those opportunities, including bringing a working group together of representatives from various industry super funds, peak bodies, the ACTU and the AIG, just to think through where those opportunities might be. I wanted to focus my comments here predominantly on infrastructure, and there's three key points that I wanted to make. The first is that there is just a fantastic opportunity to tap into this pool of industry superannuation capital to contribute to this build back, to support the economic recovery through investing in new greenfield infrastructure. I think that would be a win-win, or I mean, actually it's probably, think about it, a win-win-win of appropriate returns for, well, millions of ordinary Australians, but also at the same time, we can get new productivity enhancing infrastructure built, and we can create thousands of jobs in the process. So that kind of seems like a pretty good outcome to us. The problem is that, one of the problems is that the way that governments have typically procured these projects has kind of often led to large, often foreign-owned constructors controlling these bids. They tend to have their focus, understandably, from their perspective, on short-term construction profits. There isn't the focus necessarily on the long-term operating success of those assets. And I think we've seen that can often lead to some pretty poor outcomes for the government and for the public. Superannuation capital and other similar long-term patient capital is just getting squeezed out of that process, and we don't think that's a good outcome. So we've been working pretty actively with federal and state governments to discuss this problem, to try and sort of workshop some solutions with them, see if we can find a new, more collaborative model between government and long-term aligned equity partners like superannuation. And we think that's a really important initiative to try and unlock this sort of flow of new assets that really do need to be built. The second point is that we shouldn't just be building back, and as you used the phrase at the start, we need to be building back better. IFM's purpose is to protect and grow the retirement savings of industry super fund members over the long term. And when you take that long-term bit into account, it's critical, we think, that we play an active role in helping to address climate risk. So we've been doing quite a lot of thinking about ways in which IFM could pursue opportunities to contribute to a low carbon recovery. Already in our existing infrastructure portfolio, we've got a pretty ambitious project of cutting the carbon emissions of our Australian assets. We recently announced a reduction of nearly 8% in those emissions last year. So we've now commissioned some work by a climate specialist advisory firm to help us kind of see if we can find particular investment opportunities that we could pursue right now that would not only create jobs but contribute to this decarbonisation of our economy, which is so important. And then my third point is to note that this recession is having a disproportionate impact on certain sectors, and that as a result, that has a disproportionate effect on certain people, women, migrant and low-income earners. You've probably all seen the stats, but employment's fallen by less than 6% for men, but over 7% for women. Women, I think, saw a 12% decline in hours worked compared to 9% for men. What that means is that creating thousands of construction jobs, kickstarting new infrastructure is obviously great for the economy as a whole, but it's we need to be aware it's not the complete picture of what we want to address if we want to deal with these inequities in the recession and the recovery. So if we want to build back better, we need to try and think about how to generate an inclusive level of economic growth. IFM's thinking about that. I'd like to say we have all the solutions. We don't. We're keen to partner with other organisations, including our investors and other industrial parties, to help kind of think this through, to inform the public debate on this matter. We're resolved to kind of help look for solutions there too. Thanks, John.
You have, unlike most other funds, you have a massive global footprint. Given how much uncertainty there is in so many of the areas where you would normally be looking to invest, how do you weigh up and balance between investing locally in Australia and continuing with your global ambitions?
Well, I think you've always got to look for where the opportunities are best. But right now, we've got a significant Australian client base that is particularly attracted to investing in Australia. So I think we've got a very substantial amount of capital looking for these opportunities, because, as I mentioned, it is a win-win. We can generate attractive returns for our Australian superannuation funds and through that their members, whilst at the same time improving their job prospects by strengthening the Australian economy. So, whilst we have continued to look for opportunities right around the world, there's no doubt that we are particularly attracted to looking for opportunities in Australia.
I don't know if this is real or imagined, maybe it's exaggerated, dare I suggest it, in the media. Oh my goodness, let's blame the media. But there's always been thought to be a certain tension between the Future Fund and Industry Super. You've jumped from the Future Fund to Industry Super. How do you see Industry Super with fresh eyes? How do you see it now?
Perhaps it is imagined, John. Perhaps it is created because it's kind of fun for people to create these things. Because my perspective would be that there's an awful lot more similarities than differences. One of the things that really struck me at the Future Fund was very important for me personally at the Future Fund, and I know it's important for the staff there, is the sense of purpose that comes with building wealth for the nation. But there is absolutely no lesser strength of purpose, in fact, possibly a stronger sense of purpose within IFM, and that I've witnessed across the industry fund movement, that comes with building the wealth of Australians through their superannuation. So, that's a really strong parallel. There's also obviously a very similar parallel in terms of the professionalism that people bring to their task, and the desire to just do the right thing. So, I think that there are very many more parallels than differences, John.
Very much, Dave. And we've got one more speaker and then an opportunity to get some discussion going between the speakers before I get to your questions, which you should be sending in pretty much now so I can go through them. I've got a couple here about infrastructure and so on. We welcome your questions for all of the members of the panel, but now let's hear from Daryl Browning from ISPT.
Thanks, John. It's great to work in a sector that has the sense of purpose that David just touched on. Equally though, property probably touches almost every aspect of our life, whether it's a roof over our head, the office building you work in, the shopping centre you shop in, etc., through to the logistics and warehousing that's been I suppose, the home of all those deliveries that have been heading up to everyone's doors over the last couple of months. We do touch literally every aspect of the economy, and we're probably at the forefront, even in the current environment, of many of the issues that have faced our population. Importantly, people forget that even to run the properties takes an enormous number of people, and probably the front line has been people like the cleaners, the security guards, whether that's in the shopping centres, the office buildings for essential services, and again in logistics warehouses, and even the hotels. For our part, we manage roughly 18 billion on behalf of 30 odd investors. We're recognised in CBDs, etc., across the nation, Canberra in particular. But people mightn't realise we also stretch from as far as a shopping centre in Mount Isa to others over in the Mandurah region in WA. Property, of course, has traditionally been a relatively stable asset class. For our main fund, we've delivered a bit over 9.5% over 25 years. So it does fulfill a pretty important part of an investment portfolio. But as I said before, the members are really at the forefront of what we do. So our activities tend to cover a portfolio of 130 properties. They need reinvestment in them all the time. So our I suppose, emphasis is on buying or building new opportunities, but a massive amount of what we do is also reinvesting in the portfolio that we've got. So that rolls up into hundreds of millions of dollars each year. David touched on the greening and ESG. One of our big programs in recent years has been a rollout of solar panels on the top of all our buildings, our shopping centres and our industrial warehouses. So certainly our task at the minute with the shutdown has been that our properties have remained open, but as we know, many businesses have been forced to close either by government edict or it's simply not viable. So we see our role in the recovery taking three main forms. One is we will have to support, and we are supporting and partnering with all the occupiers of our buildings, our shopping centres, to get them through. Members indirectly will be providing relief to some of those businesses to help them get through and live to become stronger enterprises down the track. Our investment program, we're very focused on continuing that, and particularly our sustainability program. We're very keen to ensure we don't lose any momentum with that. And at the end of the day, the support from investors over the years has been really, really great to take up some of these opportunities. And I think that's one of the key messages. I think Greg touched on it in his initial introduction, that yes, out of adversity will come a massive amount of opportunity. And for the strong businesses that are well supported, well capitalised, and particularly with industry super behind them, I think there's really a fantastic opportunity to create the returns of the future by investing today and into the immediate future. So happy to take any questions, John.
For you already, Daryl, the headlines every day, there's sensationalist claims, the death of the skyscraper, airports will never be busy again, and so on. Do you have to change the weighting of your portfolio because of some of these? I know some of them are more extravagant than others, but there's probably genuine concern backing those headlines. Do you change the weighting of your portfolio because of it?
Well, our main fund's a diversified fund, so it's always had exposure to offices, retail, etc. It's fair to say in the early years it didn't have a very big exposure to retail. That it increased probably over the last 10 years, but we started winding that back about 18 months ago, where we put more emphasis into logistics and warehousing, where we could see, if you like, a re-engineering of that economy and the automation that was coming in. So that meant those properties were becoming smarter, and I think the occupiers, with the massive investment they were putting into them, they'll become quite good investments. So that's something we've certainly got on the pipeline. And then for retail, look, my belief is there's always a place for retail. It's a question of scale. Certainly with online, that will detract from it, but I can see Vicki nodding there. There will always be a place for the shop. And I was just looking at a survey this morning that said most people were saying they certainly weren't going to cut back their attendance at shopping centres and the like. I think the working from home has certainly prompted a range of reviews about how we are working, but I think the immediate impact will certainly be on travel, as we've all curtailed that. I think there's still very much a place for the office as well, and our role really is to make sure we've got the money in the right place that gives the best outcome for the members of the super funds and their retirement savings.
A lot of private developers are doing that. Does ISPT have an appetite to follow them?
Sorry, I just missed the first part of the question, John.
The rent is the latest fad. A lot of commercial developers are doing that, private developers. Do you share the appetite? You build and hold for industrial and commercial. Would you do the same for residential?
Absolutely. We've identified that as a sector. I think it's still got some way to mature to become a viable, scalable investment opportunity, but we're certainly looking at a number of opportunities. People probably don't realise in joint ventures and on our own, we've built over 3,000 apartments, so it's not something that'll be foreign to us. The operation of the portfolio for housing is a very different proposition and one that will take a bit of time to build infrastructure though.
Changes there. Look, thank you very much to you too, Daryl, and to all of our panellists. I've got a few questions for each of you, and then the questions are coming in already, and we'll make sure there's plenty of time. If you want to add your question, just type it away. I'm moderating them as we go. And if you could be specific, there's a few questions that are not to an individual, which makes it really hard. I can guess who you're intending the question to be for, but it would be better if you specifically say, if you want to, say who you are. I can see, but if you want your name read out, include that in the question, and also who the question is to, rather than to the entire panel. Greg Combet, if my first question can come back to you, please. Is it a simple conundrum? Is it as simple as, well, industry super can invest to create jobs, or industry super can invest to try and generate returns, patient capital, generating returns for members, sole purpose test and all the rest of it over the long term? Are they mutually exclusive or are they compatible? And if so, how do you weigh up if an opportunity arises and it's got more jobs than return or more return than jobs? How do you juggle that?
Thanks, John. Well, they're not mutually exclusive. We all in the super fund world make an asset allocation, so allocate a certain amount of the funds under management to particular asset classes and live within those categorisations, I guess. And obviously in each of those categories, we're looking for appropriate risk-adjusted returns. And, in job creating areas in particular and in unlisted assets like infrastructure, we're of course very mindful and extremely keen to efficiently move our investments so that they generate jobs. And but everything, as you're well aware, when you're making a decision as a superannuation trustee, is through the lens of the sole purpose test and must be in member interest. And so whilst we're generating the best returns in each of the asset classes in which we invest, we're also mindful of the other important elements that are very important, like job creation. And David Neal also mentioned issues related to climate risk. And there's a number of lenses that we all look through in making our investment decisions, but everything's driven by member interest and getting those net returns in a solid way back into member accounts. And as you know, the industry funds are all profit to member superannuation funds, and that's our sole focus.
Peter, a question about the relationships that you said were so important, relationships that have been forged by being on the CBUS board. industrial relations reform, it's the elephant in the corner of the room. We don't want to get distracted by it or diverted to it, but might those relationships forged through industry super be of benefit in resolving some of the tensions in industrial relations reform?
Don't disagree at all, John. I'm involved in 2 of the 5 IR working group reform discussions between the parties. In fact, just come from one this morning. I would suggest that the collegiality between the parties is far more focused on beneficial outcomes than it ever has been, certainly in the 25 years I've worked in member organisations. And that certainly is in part because of what we've done through superannuation, through alliances forged as we've dealt with this economic crisis as well as the health crisis. So I'm positive about some opportunities that will arise with IR, that we can get some outcomes, because at the end of the day, we know post the end of JobKeeper, that unemployment rate is going to skyrocket. And it is incumbent upon us as leaders in the country that we need to ensure we can minimise job losses, that we can actually ensure that we get job creation. So that, I think, is everyone's sole focus. And I'd continue to say if the CFMEU and the NBA can cease hostilities because of this crisis, then everyone else can, and we should be focused on ensuring that we can maximise jobs.
Would certainly be a very welcome response from what otherwise is a dreadful situation. Vicki, David Neal said that it was a very unequal impact that this coronavirus was having, and it was particularly hitting low-income people, migrants, women, and so on. But the other great inequality is between city and country. Now, you're involved in agribusiness. Can you tell us about some of the investments in regional Australia that might make a difference outside of the capital cities?
Well, thanks, John. I'll just start with a broad comment about the retail industry, because obviously it's been very highlighted as one of the harder hit segments, but equally retail is the 2nd largest employer across the nation. And if you think about country towns, retail is one of those very important part-time jobs or full-time jobs for kids, for those leaving school, for mums looking after children, and everyone else in between. So it's a very important industry, and it's quite dynamic and it's resilient. It's, we've seen retail over the decades go from the fads of being in strip shops to back to malls that are experience centres, and then equally in regional areas, they are major community hubs. They house medical services, libraries, social infrastructure where people and communities come to meet. And I certainly know that my 12-year-old daughter is just desperate to get back to the shop. So there are certain generations who are not happy to just shop at home. In terms of more regional areas, agriculture, as I said earlier, is a very important component and is something that REST has committed another $500 million to invest in over the coming years, and is a critical infrastructure role in communities, as is retail, as is construction and other industries. So I think in terms of any other details, look, we are open to, we invest in all parts of the nation. And an example is we've got quite significant investments in Western Australia. Now, REST is based in Sydney, our investment team's in Melbourne, but we've got significant investments in Western Australia. That's not so much around agriculture, but it is, if you think of wind farms creating energy, they're using property in Western Australia that couldn't be used necessarily for farming in any other way. And our 100% sole ownership of Colgar now provides 40 to 50% of all renewable energy in Western Australia. So I think when we think about regional communities and thinking about the land that's available, as well as investing in farming communities, investing in technology and helping us to offshore that around the world, I think there's a myriad of opportunities for funds to get involved in.
Lots of questions, and we'll get to those in just a second. But a question, Dave, Neal, for you before we move on to the questions that have been sent in to me. It's not too late if you want to add yours. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Once only opportunity. Dave, you've talked about externalities like climate risk and so on, but is government policy uncertainty, is that an externality that you and others have to factor in? in making decisions? In other words, if you don't know what the ground's going to be, how can you make decisions for the long term?
Sorry, reaching for the mute. Yeah, of course. When you're making long-term investments, the long-term policy environment, the long-term regulatory environment, the stability of those, they're all really important considerations for assessing what the future cash flow stream might look like, and therefore what an investment is worth and what the return you might expect is. So all of those things impact the desirability of making those investments. So, the more certainty, the more stability, absolutely the better. The more likely capital will flow into the ideas, and the more keenly priced those ideas will be. So absolutely.
Put too blunt an instrument to work here, government uncertainty in a time when they're saying how imperative it is. It's an absolute imperative that we create jobs, but government uncertainty about the future of super, and particularly industry super, is inhibiting the creation of projects that will provide jobs. In other words, government uncertainty is costing jobs.
Look, there are many aspects that feed into the uncertainty of projects. The uncertainty of superannuation, I'd suggest, probably isn't one of them, actually, because we have the capital now, and there is significant capital available. At the margin, of course, if superannuation funds have to hold more liquidity, then yes, that reduces the supply of capital that you can put into a long-term investment. And so that is true in that regard. But I think I would say that the first problem we need to solve before we have to solve that one from a purely investment perspective is getting the flow of projects moving from the government. We have the capital available, even with the sort of uncertainty around regulation and liquidity. So it's the pipeline of projects that is the biggest issue for us.
Lots of questions. We've got 15 minutes to deal with them, so I'll whip into them now, but it's not too late if you want to add yours. First question is for Greg Combet from Killian Plasto. How would scrapping increases to the super guarantee affect ISA's plans for 200,000 jobs in the next 3 years? For instance, if the super guarantee stays at 9.5%, how many jobs would be created by industry super projects then, instead of the 200,000 that you say you could do?
We haven't modelled that specifically, John, and Karen, I think it is, who might have submitted that question. But if the super guarantee is frozen at 9.5%, as David Neal was just pointing out also, that significantly reduces the contributions that are expected to be coming into the superannuation system over the next 5 years. Quite significantly reduces it, and that will be less money available for investment in the Australian economy. In relation to the 200,000 jobs figure that's part of our campaign, as I said when I spoke earlier, it's a conservative number. We expect it to be greater. It's largely focused on our current capacity to invest in capital expenditure programs in assets that are currently held by the industry funds and by the funds managers like ISPT, Cbus Property and IFM. And I think one of the other journalists might have asked a question about the nature of the projects. We're not in a position to identify all of those that have been taken into account in coming up with that number, but some of the things that are contemplated are finalising the Brisbane Airport second runway, for example, a range of significant upgrades to airports at Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide, Ausgrid, in which Australian Super and IFM investors have a majority interest and operational control, has very large CapEx programs that will be financing. I think ISPT's got shopping centres in Frankston and Perth that it's investing in, and a commercial building in Melbourne. Cbus are investing in a large commercial building project in Adelaide as well. We're investing in a range of emissions reduction programs, particularly at the Australian airports, by installing very large-scale solar panel generation, and without droning on and chewing up all the time, I hope that gives a bit of a feel for the types of things that we are doing that are part of our current plans. They won't change. But if the super guarantee is frozen, a very significant amount of contributions that should be coming into the system and being able to invest it in the Australian economy won't be possible.
Joanna Mather from the Fin Review. ISPT recently pulled out as the buyer of a 30,000 square metre tower planned at 39 Martin Place as part of the Overstation development. Does that suggest ISPT has less, not more appetite for property, or was there something else at play? What was wrong with that deal, she asks?
It was a pretty simple one. Simply the market had corrected and the outlook for growth had changed. And we took the view that we weren't prepared to pay the price that had been negotiated in phase one, and consequently we couldn't get agreement with the vendor on a price they were satisfied with, and negotiations stalled. Other than that, it was a simple commercial judgment.
Appetite. Just this was a one-off, wasn't such a great deal as
we still have
a
lot of appetite. We're looking at a number of opportunities at the moment. If we can buy at the right price, obviously we're still interested in adding to our portfolio. That deal was about $1 billion, and certainly we've got the capacity to still transact. And in fact, we're looking at a couple of things right now.
Thanks very much, Daryl. Gerard Noonan from Media Super asks a question for David Neal. David, does IFM have a preference to taking equity stake in an infrastructure development, or is it in a position just to provide debt funding rather than take equity?
The answer is IFM has the ability to do either of those things. So it can deploy capital either way, depending on the nature of the deal. We don't mind either way, John.
Excellent, thank you indeed. A question for Vicki Doyle. It's posed as an alternative, and Greg's already had a lot of airtime. So Vicki, do you anticipate the majority of the 19 billion will be used to directly invest in assets? That is, do you anticipate owning and operating those assets? What do you make of the idea put forward by the Financial Services Council, which to create something called an Australian superannuation and infrastructure investment vehicle, which would allow for units to be sold off to investors? Vicki, does that appeal to you?
Well, I think in answering to the second one, that is primarily targeted at SMSF investors who typically don't have access to these type of infrastructure investments. So REST already and other industry funds already have tried tested methods of working with state governments and federal governments. REST, for example, has joint ownership of Endeavour and investment in Endeavour Energy, which is in New South Wales. The government owns 50% and we're the second or third biggest investor in that. So that's not particularly a mechanism that applies for us, but it could apply for SMSF. And on the first question, John, just around, I think the question was, I wasn't sure what the 19 billion was referring to. So I just want to confirm the first part of that question.
Operating assets that you invest in is the purpose of the 19 billion. In other words, not just spending the 19 billion to build something, but to own and operate. Yes, so we have examples of that today where we might have some of our staff sitting on a board potentially in various investments. We are involved in campus living, for example, which is student accommodation right across Australia. So we have a combination of ownership structures. Sometimes, like David said, we'll provide debt. Sometimes we will invest through an equities mechanism. Sometimes, like Colgar, we will 100% solely own that, and we'll get much more involved in active management of those assets. So it just depends on the type of proposition that's coming up and whether we have the right expertise to make additional value in that. You in on the idea from the Financial Services Council for something called an Australian superannuation and infrastructure investment vehicle, which would allow for units to be sold off to investors. Good, bad idea? Does it apply? Does it have an impact on industry super as a sector?
Sorry, that was my first comment, which is I think that's more applicable for SMSFs who don't typically have those sort of vehicles to access this, whereas industry funds like REST access those type of investments through all the existing infrastructure. So it's not something that's relevant for us, but perhaps relevant for SMSF.
Bernie, I'm wondering if that has an effect, Bernie Dean, if you can join us on this one, if that has an effect on the sector overall and the pool of funds and the way assets are being competed for in the marketplace.
Sorry about that, John. If I get it right, the question was just about whether the FSC's proposal would, and not getting up, would limit the capacity of the sector more generally. Well, that's an interesting question. I think that maybe those that are on the investment side of the equation might be better placed to answer it. But what we've been doing through IFM, ISPT, AIST, and also through ASFA is encouraging a single front from the sector. So quite early in the piece, ASFA, AIST, and ourselves were presenting to government a united front of the sector so that we get away from this idea of, oh, well, that's an idea that comes from the retail sector, that part of the sector, or that's an idea that comes from the industry part of the sector. As they say on the telly, we're all in this together. And when it comes to the capacity to invest in projects and projects and infrastructure that can generate jobs, the colour of the money is the same. And we would like to think that regardless of what part of the sector you come from, the government should be listening to ways in which they can, as David Neal was saying, match that pipeline of potential projects with the pipeline of funding that we have all across the sector.
Thank you. A question for David Neal from Jennifer Duke. As has been reported widely, IFM's proposal for the Melbourne Airport rail link is expected to be rejected by the Victorian Andrews State Labor government. Is this a one-off issue, or David, do you expect difficulties working with state governments on infrastructure projects into the future? What needs to be done to ensure projects get off the ground in a timely manner? Asks Jennifer. David.
Yeah, thank you. Look, on the specific deal, you know, we still think we've put forward a very strong proposition, and you know, it's a matter for the government to decide one way or the other. We haven't heard yet, so we're still very hopeful. We've proposed committing up to $7 billion to help create an 18-minute trip to the airport, and perhaps even more importantly, it would transform the transport connections to the north and west for Melbourne, and that's such an important corridor. So we think it's a pretty strong proposition. You know, as to how governments make these decisions and the future of them, I mean, I think by definition they're sort of in some ways all one-offs. The government has a complex set of problems it's trying to solve for. You know, I was referring earlier to how we can perhaps improve the procurement mechanisms to provide a closer dialogue between government and those who are contributing expertise and capital. And I think that would really help this process. It would mean there is a little more certainty for all concerned. I think it would help unlock the flow of projects. So there is work to do, yes, between the private sector and state and federal government to make this process run more smoothly.
I could invite you to comment on this question as well, because it seems to me as if almost this is an example, a litmus test almost, of the preparedness of everybody to pull in the same direction to get a project off the ground.
That's absolutely right, John. I mean, we know procurement is so incredibly important, and we know that there are problems with procurement practices at the moment. I think sometimes the governments can get confused between their role as a regulator and their role as a client. And we need some very clear model procurement practices to maximise particularly that sharing of risk through the life of a project and clarity around risk. So there are means and ways in which we need a far more collaborative effort, and certainly strongly endorse David's comments that procurement models is a key to this in terms of a greater collaborative approach. And it's great that we're having dialogue with the NCCC, upon which I know Greg is a commissioner on, to start having those conversations in terms of how we can structure things far more effectively. So we're not only getting that investment, but we're getting a quick turnaround, and we're actually getting things built and people employed. So it's a multiple factors, and certainly it's good to see that governments and private sector are engaging in some of those spaces.
And Greg Combet, we're just about out of time. Is this the sort of thing that the National Coordinating Committee do discuss? Do they get down to that level of detail?
Yes, that's the answer. I mean, we've got a major task as a country to try and restart this economy and get jobs growing, get people back to work, as well as containing the COVID-19 virus. And you have to have detailed discussions about how that's going to be achieved. So there is a dialogue at the Commonwealth level and with the state governments, particularly the Eastern Seaboard states, about how to get big projects going, bring them forward and give the private sector confidence to mobilise that capital expenditure. It is really important for the economic recovery and the long-term future of our country, and I hope that we can pull it off.
David, Neal, you talked before about climate risk and the need to invest in clean energy and the like. Is that another elephant in the corner of the room? That's one of the great unknowns. There's an enormous capacity for investment in particular in clean energy and alternatives to fossil fuels, but you need some political clarity, some government reassurance before you do that. So how likely are you going to get that in the current climate?
Well, we touched on that before, John. I think that obviously the more clarity that you can get from policy positions and the regulatory environment, the better. So clearly that's right. But increasingly, these initiatives are paying for themselves anyway. They make sense anyway. And as Greg, I think, touched on before, there are a lot of initiatives already going in to existing assets to reduce carbon emissions. So significant solar farms on our Northern Territory's airports, for example, which have created significant reductions. So there's it's not all dependent on policy. We're not sitting here waiting for government to make decisions. We can get on with it. There is significant decarbonisation we can do, but very clearly, the more certainty we can get, the better.
Very much, David. We're almost out of time, and miraculously we've kept to time. There's a first opportunity, one that's almost never to be repeated, a first time for everything, I must say. It's now for Bernie Dean to thank all the participants and wrap up proceedings, but thank you very much from me. Now, Bernie, over to you.
Thanks very much, John. And I must say you did a great job. And we might even be looking at a new format that we can take forward from here on in. So thank you very much for your adept facilitation of the session today. Also, thanks very much to all of our panel. I think that what people who are unfamiliar with the industry super funds would have seen today is that unity of purpose that flows from trustees through to the administrators of these funds, whether they be funds that have a direct connection with members, or whether they be the investors that provide services to those funds and get the benefits back to members. That unity of purpose, that single-mindedness is the thing I think that even comes through to me as part of this session. We can spend a lot of time talking about infrastructure investments and everything else, but we always have to remember that this is about individuals, it's about workers and their families saving for retirement. And if their voice is to be heard today in a forum like this, it would be one of, well, I don't really understand how a lot of this stuff works, but I do know that super is really important to my future. And we did some polling a little while ago. We asked people in the midst of the coronavirus, do you think it's time for the super guarantee to be frozen or should it continue? And over 2/3 of working Australians said we need to continue with the super guarantee. We need policy stability. That's a really clear message from people that rely upon these funds to continue to deliver the benefits for their retirement. So that would be their voice, and hopefully in future sessions we'll have that message more directly. But I'd like to thank everybody, especially also the media, for attending today. We hope that this has been insightful for you, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.